Hello and welcome to this first video about Latin and the Latin language, and we're going to start off with a video about nouns. Now nouns are one of the most important parts of any language, and if you don't know what a noun is, they're really simple. They are people, objects or things. Now nouns in English are quite easy. They're things like the computer, the sandwich, a leg, a girl, a plate, whatever. In Latin, they're slightly more complicated, but what we'll do is we'll start off with some English nouns, and we'll identify the properties of nouns before translating them and transferring them into Latin. So let's start off with an English sentence that I'm going to write. So let's have the girl loves the slave. Now we're going to use some sort of Latin-y vocabulary. You know, that makes it easier to translate in a couple of minutes' time. But first of all, let's identify where our nouns are in the sentence. So it's pretty simple. We've got a noun here and we've got a noun here. And we know this because the girl is a person, object or thing, and the slave is a person, object or thing. Now we know that loves is not a noun because if you put the word the before it, you get the loves, which doesn't really make that much sense. In fact, loves is a verb, but we'll come on to verbs in a later video. So in English, these nouns are both sort of looking pretty much the same, and if you didn't think about it that much, you might think that there is no real difference aside from obviously the things they denote. But actually, they serve particular functions in the sentence, which we'll look at later. But first of all, let's have a look at the properties of a noun. So a noun has three properties. First of all, it has number, and this is the one that we have in English. So it's not like 10, 15, 100, but number is whether something is singular, so there's one of them, like the girl, because there's only one girl, or whether they're plural. So for example, you may have girls, or you may have slaves. Singular and plural are the two sort of general types of number that we have. There are more of them in other languages across the world, but we don't have to worry about them in English or in Latin. So let's write this down. So nouns, first of all, have a number, which is singular or plural. Now, the second thing that they have is to do with their function, and this is where English becomes a little bit difficult, because English doesn't denote their function. English uses word order quite strictly. It has a strict word order. So we can read the girl loves the slave, and we know that it is the girl who's doing the loving, and it's the slave who is the one who's receiving the loving. Now, if we were to change this round, if we had the slave loves the girl, then it would be the slave doing the loving. Now, in Latin, it's different because it doesn't matter what order the words are in. You could have the girl loves the slave loves the girl, loves the slave the girl the slave loves, whatever. You could have it any way around at all and it would not matter because the function of each word is not defined by what position the word is in, but instead by what marking, what sort of ending each word has. And each word has a different function in the sentence, and we call this its case. So let's have a look a bit more at cases. So what are the cases in this sentence here? So the girl is doing the action, and we call this the subject, or more strictly, we call it... Oh, I don't know what happened there. We call it... Let's get my colour back again. We call it the nominative. Let's scroll back up. There we go. Now, the slave is the thing that's receiving the action. And so we call this the object. Or, again, more strictly, and in what we use in Latin, is we call it the accusative. So we have a nominative noun doing the verb, and we have an accusative noun receiving the verb. And this is a case, so the nominative case and the accusative case. Now, the third thing that they have is something that we definitely don't really have anymore in English, and the vast majority of other languages I can think of do have it. Latin has gender. Now, this doesn't mean that each noun, each thing is inherently one gender or another. It's just a word to categorize different sort of varieties of noun. So, for example, while the girl is feminine, and while, say, the boy is a masculine noun, other nouns don't have that connection. So, for example, table in Latin is mensa, which is a feminine noun, but obviously a table is not feminine. So, to examine gender, which we'll write over here, let's start looking at Latin. So let's sort of draw a line under our English and around our definition of nouns, and let's take a look at how we translate some of these words. So if you were to look at a dictionary, you would see that you'd have something like girl, and you'd be given puella, and you'd see something like slave, and you'd be given servus. Now, for the keen-eyed people out there, you'll see that immediately they have different endings. Puella ends in this A, servus ends in us. Latin is a language which loves endings, and the endings denote loads of things. In fact, the endings denote all of these three things. So, for example, girl, this A ending denotes that it is singular, it denotes that it is feminine, and it also denotes that it is nominative. It's the same with servus. This denotes that it is singular. It denotes that it is, yep, you guessed it, masculine. And it denotes also that it is nominative. You see, both of these are nominative, and what you find is that the base forms of nouns you're given are always given in the nominative case. So, chuck us in at the deep end. We know what the properties of the nouns are in Latin and just generally as well. So let's have a crack at translating this sentence into Latin. So let's change colour one more time. Let's change to that colour there. And let's do it bit by bit. So we've got the girl, and we know that the girl is the thing that's doing the loving. We know that it's the subject of our sentence, so we know that it's in the nominative. Okay, so girl in the nominative, girl, puella, and we know that because it's the base form of the noun, we put it in the nominative, and we just copy it down. Puella. Easy. That's the easiest part of it. Next part, we've got this verb, loves. Now, in Latin, verbs tend to come towards the end of the sentence. This is just a sort of the way that it's happened. And we'll do verbs a little bit more in another video. But for the time being, I'll just write out what loves is, which is amat. And then we come to the slightly more tricky bit. So we have the slave here. And we have our word servus. But you'll notice that this us ending is only for the nominative. And in our sentence, the slave is the thing that's receiving the loving. It's the object. It's in the accusative. So what we need to do is we need to change this to show that it's accusative. So in Latin, what you do is you break it down. You have the stem, which is so, and then you break it away from its nominative ending, which is us, and you get rid of that. And you add on the new ending. Now, this new ending is singular, masculine, so you wouldn't have the same ending for puella, but it is accusative this time, and this ending is Okay, it's And this is the same for all nouns of this type that end in us. Us always becomes in the masculine singular accusative. So if you had a word like portus, that would become port. If you had a word like, what's another word that we can go for? If you had another word like arvus, which means arvus, which means grandfather, you would go to arwum. Okay, it's the same pattern. So to put this one into the accusative, we just change the ending so it's singular and masculine still, but it's accusative, and so we write it in. So servum. Puella, the girl, amat loves servum, the slave. And we know that the puella is the thing doing the verb because it's in the nominative, and we know that servum, the slave, is the thing receiving the loving because it's in the accusative. Easy peasy. And there is the first Latin sentence. So this might all seem the tiniest bit odd. We've got all of this new information and we've got a couple of new concepts. So let's go over it just to make sure that we know what's going on here. So what I'll do is I will get rid of all of this. Let's get rid of all of that. Excellent. And let's try another sentence. So in the last exercise, we had the girl loves the slave. And I said that in English, word order really matters, but in Latin it doesn't. So in this one, let's go for the slave loves the girl. So once again, let's identify what each noun is doing. So one noun and the second noun. Again, this time it's the slave who's loving. So the slave is in the nominative and the girl is in the accusative because it's the girl who's receiving the loving. So let's get our translations up again. So we know that girl is puella and we know that slave is servus. And let's do some manipulation again. So the slave, we know it's singular. We know that slave as a noun is masculine, but this time it's in the nominative. So the nominative is the same as the base form, and so we can just take that down one more time. We can just copy it out because that is the nominative masculine singular that we get in our dictionary. We know that loves is exactly the same, it's amat. And this time the girl is in the accusative. So last time we changed servus into servum to put it into the accusative. And this time we're going to have to do something similar with puella. But puella is feminine, whereas servus is masculine. So instead of just changing it into puellum isn't really a word that exists as far as I know. We have to change it into the feminine singular accusative. And so the way we do that is, again, we split it up. So we take puel is the stem and we cut off the nominative ending. And this time we add the accusative feminine singular ending, which is am. And it's the same with all other nouns like this. So you have a word like wine jar. Amphora becomes am in the accusative. Agricola, which means farmer, becomes agricolam. Again, my pen isn't working properly. Becomes agricolam in the accusative. You'll notice that it's similar to this Now, this is just sort of a little bit of an interesting thing. A is the sort of feminine letter, and U or O, as we'll see a bit later, is the masculine letter. Now, all accusative nouns end in Latin in the singular in M. Okay, so that's your way to sort of know it. You take your nominative noun and you just stick an M on the end in the best way you can. So puella becomes puellam. Servus, you can't really have servusm, so you just chock off the F and you have servum instead. But that's you don't need to worry too much about that. All you need to know is that the feminine singular accusative ending is am. So in this case we have puellam. So servus, nominative, loves, amatin is our verb, the girl, puellam, which we know is now in our accusative case. So just to recap, one last time. Let's choose another colour. We know that all nouns have case, number, and gender. And we know that for our purposes for the moment, we know that masculine nouns and we have feminine nouns, and we've only done the singular, we'll do plural a bit later on. But if we write a little table out, we have nominative and accusative. We know that masculine nouns in the nominative end in us, accusative nouns in masculine end and then we do the same with feminine. Feminine nominative nouns end in a, and feminine accusative nouns end in am. And this is our first noun ending table. and it's worth just sort of learning this because it's a really, really important part of the Latin language. So that's where we're going to leave this first video on Latin nouns. Take a look over this. If you've got any questions, ask them in the comments, and hopefully there'll be another video on some more complicated Latin nouns, including plurals, including the third gender in Latin, which is neuters, and then a bit on verbs in the very near future. Thank you very much.